Before his reign ended, Aerys II Targaryen had ordered enough wildfire buried beneath the streets of King's Landing to incinerate every soul within the city walls. 500,000 people, gone in a single breath of flame. His final command to his pyromancers was 2 words: burn them all. What history never asks is this: what was he before the fire? Let the day release its hold on you, slowly and without ceremony. Whatever you were carrying through its hours, the weight of decisions made, the quiet friction of ordinary moments, you do not need to hold any of it now. Let your shoulders settle. Let your breathing find its own unhurried rhythm, the way a tide finds the shore without effort, without direction, simply because it cannot help but do so. You are somewhere safe tonight. The light is low, the air is still. Somewhere beyond the walls of wherever you are resting, the world continues its business, but it does not require your presence. Not yet, not until morning. Tonight we are going backward through time. Not a little way, not months or a decade, but centuries. We are going to a kingdom that existed when the name Targaryen still carried the weight of dragonfire and unchallenged rule, when the Iron Throne was new enough that men still spoke of its forging with something close to awe. We are going, most particularly, to one man, a king, not the king you expect, not the raving fire-obsessed tyrant of legend, though we will reach him before this night is over. We are going first to the young man he was before any of that, the man before the fire, the king before the madness, because if you begin a story at its worst moment, you miss the tragedy entirely. Aerys II Targaryen was 18 years old when he took the Iron Throne. He was silver-haired, as Targaryens tended to be, and the old accounts describe him with a kind of cautious enthusiasm. Charming, quick-witted, possessed of a restlessness that his father, Jaehaerys II, had lacked entirely. Jaehaerys had been a careful king, competent and steady. The kind of ruler who keeps a kingdom from disaster without ever making it feel like anything more than the absence of catastrophe. The court that assembled for Aerys' coronation had grown tired of competence. They wanted vitality. Aerys, at 18, seemed to offer exactly that, the particular energy of a young man who has not yet discovered that governing a continent is more complicated than wanting to do it well. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. Among the faces that watched the coronation of Aerys II, 2 mattered above all others in what followed. The first was Rhaella, his new queen, his own sister, bound to him under the old Targaryen custom that preserved the Dragonlord bloodline by folding it back upon itself, generation after generation. Rhaella was 18 as well, solemn in a way her husband was not, and she wore her new title with the careful composure of someone who had understood from a young age that her life was not entirely her own to shape. She had been told who she would marry before she was old enough to have an opinion about it. The second face was Tywin Lannister's, not yet Hand of the King, but already unmistakably the most capable political mind in the room. A man with a stillness about him that made you aware, even from a distance, that he was calculating something. Tywin and Aerys had been friends since childhood, the kind of friendship that forms between young men who share tutors and training yards and long afternoons with nothing particular to do, who grow up together and therefore know one another with an intimacy that later friendships never quite replicate. There was genuine warmth between them in those early years, whatever came after. Aerys trusted Tywin in the way that only those who have known someone before they needed them can trust, not with wariness, but with the relaxed confidence of deep familiarity. He named Tywin his hand within the first years of his reign, and the appointment transformed the administration of the realm so thoroughly that the prosperity of Aerys's early years became difficult to disentangle from Tywin's governance. Full granaries, maintained roads, a treasury that for once exceeded its projections. When men of that generation spoke of the golden years before everything fell apart, they were speaking, in large measure, of what Tywin built. The Red Keep in those years had a quality that old histories try to evoke and never quite capture. Fires burned in its great hall through the evenings, the kind of steady, generous warmth that makes a place feel inhabited rather than merely occupied. Ravens came and went with the letters of a functioning kingdom. Lords arrived from distant seats to present themselves and their grievances, and Aerys, genuinely curious, genuinely present, would receive them. He asked questions that showed he had been listening. His council meetings, unlike those of his later years, were structured things, productive in the ordinary grinding way that governance requires productivity to be. The men around the long table in the small council chamber argued about grain prices and border disputes and the allocation of tax revenues. And the arguments, while heated, reached conclusions. The kingdom was run. It was an unremarkable achievement in the way that health is unremarkable until its absence makes you remember what it was. What is striking when you examine all of this is how long the promise held. The madness that eventually consumed Aerys II did not announce itself like a lightning strike. It crept. It arrived over more than a decade, wearing different disguises. Ambition first, then a sharpening irritability, then a paranoia so gradual that those around him found it nearly impossible to identify the precise moment it crossed from understandable vigilance into something they could not explain away. It is worth pausing here, just for a moment, breathing with the weight of that thought. A great many intelligent and capable people watched Aerys deteriorate and chose, at each successive step, not to say so plainly. They had their reasons. The Lord saw the peace and weighed it against the discomfort. Tywin saw the surplus in the treasury and told himself the surplus mattered most. The friends who had known him longest looked at the increasingly strange man behind the increasingly tired eyes and found the old Aerys somewhere in there, or told themselves they did, or needed to believe they did in order to go on serving him. This is a profoundly human thing to do. We are all of us inclined to explain away the difficult evidence when it arrives from someone we have loved or trusted, to find the interpretation that allows the relationship to continue, rather than the one that demands we act on what we actually see. The lords around Aerys were not cowards, or not exclusively cowards. They were people doing what people do when the truth is inconvenient and the comfortable alternative remains just barely plausible. He was under pressure. Every king had difficult periods. They had all known steadier rulers who had passed through difficult seasons and come out the other side. They waited for Aerys to steady, and they went on waiting, while the signs that something was fundamentally wrong accumulated like a slow snowfall, each flake barely significant, the accumulation impossible to ignore until it suddenly was. He began to contradict Tywin's counsel in small ways, then in larger ones, not because he had arrived at better ideas, but because he needed to assert that the crown was genuinely his own, rather than the ornamental portion of an arrangement that Tywin was actually running. He became uncomfortable when foreign dignitaries praised his hand's efficiency too warmly, receiving the compliments with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He began to take an uncomfortable interest in certain courtiers. in old rumours, in perceived slights that those who had delivered them had long forgotten. His sleep, by some accounts, became irregular. His hair, once kept with the care appropriate to his station, grew gradually unkempt. His nails, similarly. These are small things to note. They are small things to note precisely because they seemed small at the time, and because those around him chose to see them as such, rather than as the early signatures of something that could not be fixed by rest, or by the passing of a difficult season. Rhaegar grew around him during this period of slow change. Born in the year 259, during the fire at Summerhall that killed several members of the royal family, the ruins of that pleasure castle were a blackened monument to Targaryen ambition for the rest of the dynasty's existence. Rhaegar came into his young adulthood as something his father had not anticipated. He was a reader, quiet in public spaces, drawn to the old books and to the music of the harp. He was also, as he grew older, extraordinarily beloved by nearly everyone who encountered him. He had the charisma that Aerys had once possessed, but in Rhaegar it was deeper, less in need of an audience, more genuinely rooted in something interior. Lords who met him spoke of him afterward with a warmth they had ceased by that point to reserve for his father. Aerys felt this. He noticed the way rooms changed when his son entered them, the way men's postures shifted from courtesy into something closer to genuine reverence. And what he felt in response was not the pride of a father, but the anxiety of a king who had begun, quietly and without admitting it even to himself, to fear that his heir might be planning to replace him. The Queen Rhaella endured these years with the composure she had always displayed, raising her children with quiet care, fulfilling her public duties with the particular discipline of someone who had learned early that dignity was the one thing that could not be taken from you, as long as you refused to surrender it. What passed between her and Aerys in the privacy of the Red Keep's inner chambers is territory that history has always trodden carefully around. She was, by the evidence of what she produced, Rhaegar, and eventually Daenerys, and the brief, uncertain life of Viserys in between, a woman of enormous inner resource. She had to be. When you come to know Daenerys Targaryen, when you watch her cross oceans, conquer cities, and struggle with ferocious determination to be the kind of ruler she had always imagined she could be, you are watching the youngest child of this man. The child born on a storm-lashed island in the last hours of his reign, after the world he might have given her had already been taken away. She never knew Aerys. She grew up with stories. The stolen throne, the usurper who killed her father, the great injustice that her family was owed a continent in recompense for. What she was not given, because no one who told her the stories had any reason to give it, was the full picture. She was not told what he had become, or what he had done, or how many people had died because of decisions he made from a place so deep inside his own deteriorating mind that no counsel could reach him there. This is the inheritance she carried without knowing she carried it. Not the throne, the interior thing, the fire that was always part of the Targaryen blood, that in some members of the family expressed itself as brilliance, and in others as something more dangerous. She spent her early years working visibly, consciously, to be something better than her brother Viserys, who wore his madness openly and without apology. But Viserys was not the deepest inheritance. The deeper one was her father's, and she would not encounter it clearly until much later, when the choices before her had grown large enough, and the exhaustion deep enough for the simplest and most absolute version of herself to become the path of least resistance. None of this means she was simply him. She was not. The warmth she showed, the liberation of the enslaved, the careful attempts at governance in Meereen, the years of visible struggle to be better than the most terrible version of what she could have chosen to be. All of it was a conversation with a father she had never met, conducted in the only language available to her, which was action. Whether she ultimately won that conversation is a question this history cannot answer simply. But the question itself is worth holding lightly, in the way you hold something you want to examine in better light tomorrow. Let that rest now, gently. Let the thought of Aerys II, as he was at 18, before the fire reached him, before everything that was about to happen to him and because of him, settle into the quietness that is beginning to gather. The story of how he changed is long. The night is patient. The next chapter waits in the dark, where a king is about to discover what years of small surrenders finally lead to. Your breath is slower now. The weight of the day is further away. The fires of the Red Keep burn low, and the next part of this history is already beginning. But here is what the chronicles do not tell you plainly. Aerys did not become afraid of nothing. He became afraid of exactly the right things, and that is what made him so dangerous. Because a paranoid man who is sometimes correct is the hardest kind of man to stop. Let your breathing deepen a little more. There is no hurry. The night is long, and the story moves at the pace of the telling, not at the pace of history, which moves too fast for anyone inside it to track cleanly. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. Let the darkness be a restful thing, a container rather than an absence. We are still inside the Red Keep, still in the reign of Aerys II, but we have moved forward now by something like a decade, and the man we find on the throne is not precisely the man we left there. He is the same man in the way that a river is the same river. The name has not changed, the general shape has not changed, but the water is different water entirely, and the riverbed has shifted in ways you would not notice without the long perspective of time. The paranoia, when it became visible enough to name, took a particular shape. It was not the wild, uncontained suspicion of a man who feared everything and everyone equally. That would come later. In these middle years of his reign, it was more organized than that, more targeted. Aerys had constructed, in the architecture of his thinking, a small and specific circle of perceived enemies. And within that circle, the chief enemy, the central threat, the figure around whom all his anxieties had begun to orbit, was Tywin Lannister, his oldest friend, his most able servant, the man who had made his reign's prosperity possible. The man who had built so well and so visibly that the lords of the realm had begun, in their cups and in their private letters, to refer to Tywin as the real power behind the throne, and whose castle's resources, whose bannermen, whose personal wealth and prestige had begun, in Aerys's perception, to eclipse the crown itself. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. It is worth pausing on that dynamic for a long moment. The tragedy of Aerys and Tywin is not simply the story of a mad king and a capable advisor who eventually turned against him. It is the tragedy of a friendship that was real, genuinely real, documented in accounts from those who knew both men when they were young, that was destroyed not by any single betrayal, but by the slow accumulation of a particular kind of pain. Aerys had loved Tywin, as a young man loves his closest friend, with the uncomplicated warmth of a period in life before the complicated things arrive. And then the complicated things arrived. The throne made Aerys a king, but it did not make him Tywin's equal in the ways that mattered practically, and he could not bear that. He could not bear the sensation, which was accurate, not imagined, that the man beside him was more capable than he was, and that the kingdom knew it. The whispers were everywhere by the middle years. They took different forms in different mouths, but they shared a common thread, that the Lion of Casterly Rock ruled Westeros in fact, while the dragon merely ruled it in name. Some of these whispers were malicious, carried by men who enjoyed the political discomfort they created. Some were simply observational, spoken without intent to wound, by people who were noting what they saw without considering how widely their notes might travel. And some, Aerys believed this, and he was not entirely wrong, were deliberate, part of a sustained effort by Tywin's own allies to inflate the Hand's reputation at the king's expense, to position Tywin as the indispensable man so that his power could not be curtailed without the risk of visible collapse. Whether this was a calculated campaign or simply the natural consequence of Tywin being as capable as he was, the effect on Aerys was the same. He began to undermine his Hand in small ways that he believed were invisible. He overruled Tywin's recommendations in council, not consistently, not systematically, but often enough that Tywin began to feel the interference like a low-grade temperature, constant, never quite rising to the level of open confrontation, but never quite abating either. Aerys granted favours that Tywin had advised against. He appointed men to positions that Tywin had suggested should go to other candidates. He was, in these manoeuvres, performing an assertion of independence that he had never previously needed to perform, because independence had never previously felt threatened. The performance became its own problem. Tywin was not a man who suffered the appearance of subordination gracefully, and the tension between them, never spoken directly, never resolved by any honest conversation, never addressed as what it actually was, compacted over the years into something that would eventually find its release in catastrophe. There were other components to the deterioration that had nothing to do with Tywin. Aerys's relationship with his queen had been deteriorating for years by the time the middle period of his reign arrived, for reasons that the surviving accounts treat with the discretion of those who wrote, while the memory was still painful and the king still dangerous. Rhaella bore children who did not survive, miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who lived for days before dying, and each loss compounded the grief of the previous ones into something that the couple, already not close, had no resources to share or process together. The Targaryen custom of dynastic marriage had concentrated the bloodline for centuries. And the question of what that concentration had done, generation by generation, to the stability of the minds it produced, was one that the maesters of the Citadel discussed cautiously and without firm conclusion. What the accounts agree on is that Aerys began, in this period, to find enemies in places where enemies had not previously existed. The Master of Whisperers, the man who brought the king his intelligence about the realm's various plots and complications, found Aerys an increasingly receptive audience for the worst interpretations of the information he brought. A lord who had once been described as cautiously loyal was reinterpreted as strategically hedging. A letter that seemed neutral was examined for its hidden meaning, an old alliance between two houses that had nothing to do with the crown, became, in Aerys's reading, evidence of a coalition forming against him. The world around him was contracting, and the contraction felt, from inside it, like clarity, like finally seeing the threats that had always been there, finally understanding the true shape of the game being played against him. This is the architecture of paranoia, that those who have never experienced it from the inside find so difficult to understand. It does not feel like madness. It feels like awakening. The man in the grip of it is not aware of a deterioration in his reasoning. He is aware, or believes he is aware, of a new and sharper access to truth. Every new piece of evidence confirms the existing structure rather than challenging it, because the structure has become load-bearing, and dismantling it would require dismantling the self that has been organized around it. Aerys could not dismantle that structure, and so he reinforced it daily with the new material that arrived in every letter, every whispered report, every courtier's careful smile. Cersei Lannister, in the years of her own power, would display a recognizable version of this same architecture. She was not Aerys. She was more controlled, more capable of masking what she felt, far more politically sophisticated in her methods. But the essential shape of it, the contraction of trusted space until only a very small circle remained, the interpretation of all outside evidence as evidence of threat, the preference for the version of reality that confirmed the necessity of her own power, was something she had absorbed, whether she knew it or not, from the atmosphere of the court in which she grew up. She was 12 years old when she came to King's Landing to be presented as a potential bride for the Crown Prince. She was 12 years old and already learning, in the very specific school that the late reign of Aerys provided, what power that had turned in on itself looked like from the outside. The court adapted around Aerys's changing mind with the efficiency of an organism adapting to a new environment. Lords learned which topics to avoid in his presence. They learned to read the particular signals of his moods, the way his hands moved when he was agitated, the specific silence that preceded an outburst, and they positioned themselves accordingly. The maesters learned to frame their counsel in terms of the king's own stated positions, rather than in terms of the independent analysis they had been trained to provide. The small council learned to root its most difficult decisions through Tywin whenever possible, which only amplified the problem, since Tywin's necessity was precisely the thing that most disturbed Aerys's increasingly fragile equilibrium. Rhaegar, through all of this, was developing into the exact kind of young man who would guarantee that his relationship with his father remained painful. He was beloved in ways that Aerys had long ceased to be. He was the prince the lords of the realm were beginning, quietly, to look forward to, the one they spoke of in terms of the future rather than the present, the one whose accession, when it came, would solve certain problems that the present reign had created and was continuing to create. Rhaegar himself navigated this with as much care as a man of his temperament could manage. He was not politically ambitious in the conventional sense, too absorbed in books and music and the private obsession with prophecy that defined him. But his very existence as a more appealing alternative was something Aerys could feel in the air of every room he shared with his son. There was a specific incident, documented in letters from two separate members of court, who both described it with the particular care of witnesses who understood they were writing down something that should not be forgotten. At a name-day celebration, years after Joanna Lannister's death, when Aerys made a public remark about her of such pointed and inappropriate specificity that the room fell silent in the distinctive way that rooms fall silent when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Tywin was present. The accounts do not describe what Tywin did in that moment, because what Tywin did was nothing. Nothing visible, no expression, no response, no indicator that the remark had landed in any particular way. This, anyone who knew Tywin understood, was the most alarming possible response. A man who shows nothing when struck has either ceased to feel or has decided to feel in private, for later. Tywin had decided to feel in private, for later. The later in question was still some years away, and when it arrived, it would take the form not of a confrontation but of armies. The Master of Whisperers who entered Aerys' service during the middle period of his reign, the man called Varys, who had come from the free cities, and who would serve the crown through multiple reigns with equal smoothness, had a particular function in this era that was distinct from the function he served in later years. In the middle period of Aerys' decline, Varys was still primarily what he appeared to be, a gatherer and interpreter of intelligence, a man who built networks of informants and consolidated the flow of information to the crown. What he did with that role, whether he amplified or dampened particular strands of intelligence, whether he shaped what Aerys knew in ways that served purposes Varys had identified for himself outside the king's awareness, is the kind of question that the Master of Whisperers' very nature makes impossible to answer from the outside. What is certain is that the information flowing into the increasingly paranoid mind of Aerys II was not improving his condition. Whether that was the information's content, or its curation, or simply the nature of a mind that had passed the point where accurate information could correct its organizing patterns, the outcome was the same. You can let that settle now. Let it drift like smoke toward the ceiling of wherever you are lying in this quiet dark. The cracks in the glass had been forming for years. Years of small choices, small surrenders, small moments where honesty was chosen against in favor of accommodation. The Red Keep was, by this point in Aerys' reign, a place of enormous beauty and profound unease, where beautiful things happened in beautiful rooms. And underneath all of it, something was building toward a pressure that the walls could not contain forever. The night that Aerys was taken prisoner, when the walls of his self-constructed world encountered walls of an entirely different kind, was still some years away. But it was coming, and when it came, it would not leave him the same man who entered it. Some rooms change you in ways that no amount of time outside them can reverse. The dungeon at Duskendale was one of those rooms. There is a particular kind of darkness that teaches a man things he cannot unlearn. In the year 277, Aerys II Targaryen walked into a small port city on Blackwater Bay, expecting a minor dispute to be resolved by the presence of the king himself. He would not walk out again for 6 months, and the man who eventually emerged was not the man who entered. Breathe slowly. There is nothing that requires your urgency in this hour. You are lying still, and the story is lying still around you, gathering itself before it moves into the part that changes everything. Duskendale is a modest place by the standards of the places that shape the history of great kingdoms. A port town on the bay, an old castle, a local lord with a local grievance. It was not a place where anyone expected history to pivot. And yet, history has a way of finding its turning points in exactly the kind of places that do not expect to be turned. The year was 277 of the Targaryen calendar. Aerys II had been on the throne for 15 years by then, and the man who sat on it had already diverged significantly from the young king who had taken it with such apparent promise. The paranoia was established. The relationship with Tywin was corroded. The court had learned its accommodations. But there was still a functioning king, still a man who attended his council and received his lords and navigated the daily operations of a continental realm. However badly, his judgment had begun to erode. The Defiance of Duskendale, that is what history would call it, with the particular brevity that great events acquire when they are too complicated to explain simply, changed all of that. Lord Dennis Darklyn of Duskendale had a grievance with the crown. This was not unusual. Lords had grievances with the crown, the way crops had grievances with the weather, constantly, and for reasons ranging from the genuinely legitimate to the transparently self-serving. Darklin's grievance concerned a new charter of rights he wanted granted to his city, a measure that would have given Duskendale certain commercial and legal privileges that its lord believed it deserved, and that the crown had repeatedly declined to formalize. The matter had been going back and forth through official channels for years without resolution. Darklin, frustrated, did something so reckless that those who heard of it initially assumed it must be exaggerated. He invited the king himself to Duskendale to resolve the matter in person, and Aerys, against the explicit counsel of Tywin and several other members of the small council, accepted. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. The council's objections were not merely procedural. A king travelling to a vassal's castle to personally adjudicate a local dispute was unusual. A king doing so against the strong advice of his hand was concerning. Tywin, by multiple accounts, was unequivocal. The journey was unnecessary, potentially dangerous, and set a troubling precedent. Aerys ignored him. Whether this was genuine conviction that the matter required his personal presence, or whether it was another of the increasingly frequent assertions of independence from his hand, or whether the paranoia had reached a stage where the option Tywin most strongly opposed was therefore the option Aerys most strongly preferred. The historians have debated this, and the debate has not been resolved, and perhaps it does not need to be. The result was the same regardless of the motivation. The king went to Duskendale. What happened next unfolded quickly. Lord Darklin, perhaps calculating that the physical presence of the king in his castle gave him leverage he had not been able to achieve through correspondence, closed the gates of Duskendale behind Aerys and his retinue, and declined to open them. He took the king prisoner. This was not a polished coup or an organized rebellion with broad political support. It was the act of a desperate man who had gambled on something that seemed, perhaps in his imagination, less extreme than it was once he had done it. The Defiance of Duskendale was, at its root, an act of catastrophic miscalculation by a provincial lord who had a genuine grievance and no adequate means of expressing it, and who chose a means that was, in its consequences, out of all proportion to the thing it was meant to resolve. Aerys was held in a cell in Duskendale for nearly 6 months. 6 months! Let that settle for a moment. 6 months in a dungeon, in a port city, cut off from his court and his council and the physical environment of the Red Keep that had become, whatever its psychic dangers, at least familiar. Tywin, left in command at King's Landing, assembled an army and marched it to Duskendale. And then, in a decision that would feed the conspiracy theories of every historian who came after, he did not immediately storm the castle. He laid siege, and he waited. The official explanation was strategic. Darklin had threatened to kill the king if the walls were breached by force, and Tywin did not wish to provide the occasion. The less official explanation, whispered then, repeated ever since, was that Tywin waited precisely as long as a man might wait if part of him found the situation useful. Was Tywin deliberately prolonging the captivity of a king whose removal from the throne would have cleared the way for a more capable successor? This is the question that the evidence cannot quite answer. What the evidence does establish is that it was not Tywin's army that ultimately retrieved Aerys, but a single knight, Sir Barristan Selmy, already distinguished by his time in service and about to become legendary. Barristan infiltrated the castle alone, at night, moving through the walls of Duskendale with the particular combination of skill and extraordinary nerve that defined his entire career. He found the king, extracted him, and brought him out alive. Aerys II. Targaryen's physical imprisonment was ended not by the political or military machinery of his kingdom, but by one man doing an impossible thing with quiet competence. Barristan Selmy was rewarded for this with a place in the Kingsguard that he would hold for the rest of his life. The position fit him. He was that kind of man, the kind who serves because service is the organizing principle of his character, not because the person being served has earned it. The Aerys who walked out of Duskendale was not the Aerys who walked in. 6 months in darkness, genuine darkness, in a cell whose dimensions those who saw it later described as shockingly small, does particular things to particular kinds of minds. In a mind that was already fracturing, already organizing itself around patterns of threat and betrayal, the experience of actual captivity provided not a correction but a confirmation. Everything he had feared had turned out to be real. A lord had indeed attempted to use him for leverage. His own hand had perhaps doing enormous work in Aerys's reconfigured interior, allowed the captivity to continue longer than strict necessity required. The world was, in fact, a place full of men who would imprison a king if given the opportunity. Aerys had not been wrong to be suspicious. He had been right, and the 6 months in the dark had proved it. The aftermath of Duskendale was immediate and terrible. Darklyn and his family were executed, all of them in ways that went beyond what the circumstances technically required. The executions were Aerys's first, and they were carried out with a personal involvement, a specific kind of attention that made his court deeply uncomfortable. He watched. He was, those who were present reported, not simply present at the executions as a matter of royal duty, but engaged in them in a way that was different from grief or justice or even anger. Something had come loose in the dungeon that could not be put back. Some restraint, some governor on the part of himself that had previously managed the darker currents, was no longer functioning. He also stopped allowing his nails and hair to be trimmed. Blades near his body now produced a physical reaction, not panic, but a visible flinching, a reorientation of the body away from the edge. The dungeons at Duskendale had perhaps, among their other effects, introduced him to the specific fear of sharp things in the hands of people whose loyalty you could not verify. The irony would compound itself over the following years as his obsession moved away from blades and toward fire. The man who could no longer tolerate a razor near his skin became the man who burned his enemies alive in the great hall of the Red Keep. The man who feared being cut became the man who could not stop cutting. Jaime Lannister was not yet in the Kingsguard when Duskendale happened. He was a boy in those years, still in training, still in the uncomplicated era of his life, before the complications arrived. But Duskendale is where his story with Aerys truly begins, because Duskendale is where the king that Jaime would eventually swear to protect was finally and fully replaced by something else. Not replaced by a different person. The form and the name remained the same, but replaced in the essential sense that the interior architecture had been rebuilt around different principles. The man who emerged from the dungeon would, in the years remaining to him, be capable of things that the man who entered it had not been. Sir Barristan Selmy's rescue of Aerys from Duskendale deserves its own moment of consideration, because it is one of the more extraordinary single feats in the history of the Kingsguard, and because what it reveals about Barristan's character explains so much of what comes after. He went alone. He did not go as part of a military operation, did not go with a team of hand-selected knights, did not go as the advance element of a coordinated assault. He went alone at night through the walls of a hostile castle, past guards who would have killed him on sight, to extract a prisoner who may or may not have been in a condition to move quickly. He succeeded. The king came out alive, and Barristan came out alive, and the rescue became the kind of story that is told in training yards for generations as evidence of what a man committed to a singular purpose can accomplish when he is not distracted by doubt. What the story does not always include is the detail of what Barristan found when he reached the cell, the condition of the king after months of imprisonment, the specific changes in Aerys that the captivity had produced, the look in his eyes that Barristan, by some accounts, carried with him for the rest of his long life, as the image that told him everything he needed to know about what the reign was becoming. The physical Aerys who emerged from Duskendale was visibly changed in ways that required no particular knowledge of the interior changes to observe. The long months had thinned him in some places and altered him in others. His hair, uncut, had grown long and tangled in the manner of hair that has not been properly maintained under conditions of captivity. His nails had grown similarly, curving in a way that he would not subsequently permit to be corrected, because the implements required to correct them were blades, and blades were now the specific category of object that his body had decided to refuse. He walked out of Duskendale with the gait of a man who has relearned walking, carefully, after a period during which the muscles had no room to use themselves. And underneath all of this physical evidence of the months inside the cell, something in his eyes had reorganized itself around a new center. Not grief exactly, not even fear precisely. Something more settled and more permanent than either, the specific quality of a certainty that has been tested by the worst available evidence and survived intact. He had been right to be afraid. The world had proved it. He was not going to be afraid less. Let that thought settle now, gently. Somewhere in the darkness of Duskendale, something ended. Not the reign that would continue for 5 more years, long years of escalating fire and fear, and the destruction of everything that proximity to Aerys had once been worth the risk of. Not the bloodline. The bloodline would continue even after the throne fell, in the form of 2 silver-haired children carried to safety across the narrow sea. But something ended. Some version of what Aerys might have been, of what the reign might have produced, of what the friendship with Tywin might eventually have navigated back to. Some of that ended in the dark in Duskendale, quietly, without anyone to witness it or mourn it as the particular loss it was. Rest now for a moment in that understanding. The next part of the story is harder, and it begins with fire. The dungeon in Duskendale had given Aerys a new fear and a new love. He feared blades now, with the specificity of a man who has imagined them too long in a small dark room. And fire. Fire had become something else entirely. Something that clarified rather than threatened. Something that solved. Let your body be heavier now than it was a moment ago, sinking slowly into the surface beneath you. The way a stone sinks through still water, not falling, simply descending, at the pace of its own quiet weight. The night has been with you long enough that your bones know the difference between the tension of waking and the softness of rest. Stay in the softness. The history we are carrying tonight is not light history, but it is old history, distant enough to observe with the particular steadiness that distance makes possible. You are safe in the present. The past is simply a country we are visiting, and we can leave it when we choose. The Aerys who emerged from Duskendale was, in the years that followed, a man organizing his newly reorganized interior around a new center of gravity. That center was fire. It is difficult to trace exactly where the obsession began. Fire had been part of the Targaryen identity for 3 centuries, embedded in the family's mythology so deeply that it was almost devotional, and Aerys had grown up with all of that. But before Duskendale, fire had been a symbol, a heritage, a family inheritance spoken of with pride. After Duskendale, something shifted. Fire became, for Aerys, a philosophical position. It was the purifier, the solution, the thing that cut through complexity and ambiguity and left only the clean, simplified truth of ash. In his mind, and this is the crucial thing, the thing that separates what he was from simply being cruel for cruelty's sake, in his mind, fire solved problems. The pyromancers, who had existed as a guild at the fringes of the court's attention for a long time, found themselves suddenly central. These were men who worked with wildfire, the substance that the alchemists of Westeros had developed over centuries, the green-burning compound that could not be quenched by water and burned through stone and required conditions so specific for its creation that the process was more ceremony than chemistry. Wildfire was not new. It had been used in wars before, including the Targaryen Wars. But Aerys's relationship with the pyromancers, and with the wildfire they produced, became something different from strategic deployment. It became intimate. He would spend hours in the alchemist's quarter, among the ceramic pots and the careful men who handled them, watching and asking questions. He funded their operations with an enthusiasm that the Crown had never previously directed at them. They produced more wildfire than had been produced in generations at his command, in quantities that went beyond any conceivable military application. The executions began. This is the part of the history that is most documented, most discussed, most often cited as evidence of the madness, not because it is the most extreme thing Aerys eventually did, but because it was public, witnessed by his court, and therefore impossible for the people around him to explain away as they had explained away so many smaller signs. The burning of Lord Rickard Stark is the name that appears in every account. Rickard Stark, the Lord of Winterfell, the father of Eddard Stark and Brandon Stark, a man of the North with the North's particular reserve and the North's particular sense of honour, had come to King's Landing demanding the release of his son. Brandon Stark had ridden to the Red Keep in a fury, shouting for Rhaegar to come out and be fought, because Rhaegar had taken, or appeared to have taken, Lyanna Stark, and Brandon had the eldest son's instinct to ride toward a problem rather than away from it. Brandon Stark's arrival in King's Landing became, in Aerys's reading of it, evidence of exactly the kind of conspiracy he had long feared. Not a son acting on grief and fury without adequate thought. Not the understandable rage of a brother who believed his sister had been taken against her will. In Aerys's interpretation, it was organized, deliberate, a coordinated provocation by the northern families against the crown. He had Brandon arrested, and then, when Rickard arrived to demand his son's release, as any father would, as any lord of Rickard's position was obligated to do, he had Rickard arrested as well. He then charged them both with treason, a charge he was technically empowered to make, and which bore no reasonable relationship to anything either man had actually done. The execution that followed was not an execution in any conventional sense. It was a performance. Rickard Stark was placed in the Great Hall in full armour and suspended above a fire, which was lit beneath him. He burned in the armour, which conducted heat in the particular way that metal conducts heat, slowly enough for everyone present to understand what was happening. Brandon Stark was brought in to watch his father, with a device around his throat connected to a mechanism that would tighten as he struggled, the implication being that his efforts to free himself would only accelerate his own death. He was a young man of great physical strength and the most comprehensive will to act that his family's blood produced, and he struggled, and he died struggling, as his father burned above him. It is worth sitting with that for a long, quiet moment. It is worth letting the full weight of it arrive before moving on. These were not minor figures, not distant abstractions. These were the father and elder brother of Eddard Stark, the man who would become the Warden of the North, the Lord of Winterfell, the embodiment of the northern virtue that the entire realm would come to associate with the name Stark. The execution of Rickard and Brandon was not simply an atrocity in isolation. It was the act that set the North permanently and irrevocably against the crown. It was the act that turned Jon Arryn and Robert Baratheon and every lord with a connection to either family into active enemies rather than nervous subjects. It was the act that made the rebellion not merely possible, but inevitable. And it was committed by a man who was, by this point, interpreting his own isolation as evidence that he was surrounded by traitors rather than evidence that he was creating them. Wildfire is not a substance that can be understood adequately through description alone, but the accounts of those who worked with it, the pyromancers, who developed a technical relationship with it over lifetimes of careful handling, give some indication of why it exerted the fascination over Aerys that it did. It burned green. This is the first and most startling fact about it. In a world where all ordinary fire is the familiar amber and orange of combustion, wildfire burned an intense, almost luminous green that had no analogue in nature, and that the eye therefore refused to categorize as ordinary. It could not be extinguished with water. Water, poured on wildfire, accelerated it. The compound reacted with moisture in a way that intensified rather than quenched the reaction, so that any instinct toward conventional fire suppression became a catastrophic error. It penetrated stone. Given sufficient quantity and sufficient time, it burned through the same materials that walls were built from, the same foundations that cities rested on, compromising the structural integrity of everything it touched in ways that water damage and wind damage never quite achieved. The ceramic pots the pyromancers stored it in were chosen for their impermeability under extreme conditions, handled with the specific reverence of men who understood that a single cracked vessel in the wrong circumstances could render a building uninhabitable and a street impassable for hours. Aerys sat among these men and these pots with the focused calm of a man who had found, at last, the thing that matched the scale of what he feared. The contradiction at the heart of the fire obsession, the specific irony that distinguishes it from simple cruelty, is that Aerys himself had acquired, in the dungeon at Duskendale, an acute fear of sharp things while simultaneously becoming the man who burned his enemies alive in the Great Hall. He could not tolerate a razor near his skin. The long nails, the unkempt hair, these were not failures of self-regard, but consequences of a genuine physical recoil from blades in proximity to his body. And yet the thing that he turned to as his solution, his instrument, his final argument against the world that had imprisoned him, was fire. The dungeon had taught him to fear a specific kind of harm, and he had responded by becoming the agent of a different and far more total kind. There is something almost philosophical in that inversion, not a lesson he intended to teach, not an irony he perceived, but there nonetheless, visible from the outside, in the way that the patterns of a person's life are sometimes visible to everyone except the person living them. Jaime Lannister was by this point a member of the Kingsguard. He had been named to it in one of Aerys's more deliberate maneuvers against Tywin, because the Kingsguard required that its members renounce inheritance, and Jaime was Tywin's heir. And placing Jaime in the Kingsguard was a way of depriving Tywin of his succession with the appearance of legal legitimacy. The cruelty of the move was characteristic of the period, but it had a secondary effect that Aerys had not intended. It placed Jaime in the throne room for the executions. The Kingsguard's role was to protect the king and to attend him, and Jaime was a member of the Kingsguard now. And so he stood in his white cloak and watched Rickard Stark burn and Brandon Stark die, and he did not act because his oath bound him to the king's person, and because he was 19 years old, and because the accumulated weight of what to do in this situation was something no one had prepared him for. The wildfire caches were accumulating beneath the city through this same period, though Aerys kept that particular project contained to the pyromancers and to himself. Beneath Dragonstone's sept, beneath the great sept of Baelor, in King's Landing, beneath the stables and the granaries, and the street-level buildings along the most populated corridors of the city, the pots were placed carefully in an architecture of destruction that was, in Aerys's imagining, a failsafe. If the enemies came, if the conspirators finally moved against him openly, he would not be taken prisoner again. He would not return to a cell. He would burn instead and take the whole city with him, and the fire would be the end that was also, in the peculiar logic he had built around it, a kind of purification. Daenerys, crossing the narrow sea decades later with her 3 dragons and the conviction that she was returning home to reclaim what was hers, was bringing fire back to the city that her father had tried to turn to ash. There is something in that juxtaposition that is almost too large to hold in a single thought. Her fire came in the form of living creatures. Beautiful, ancient, the last of something that had been gone from the world for a century and a half. And in her hands, or so the early chapters of her story suggested, it was a force for liberation, rather than for destruction. She broke chains with it. She opened gates. She turned the calculus of fire from weapon to something closer to symbol, insisting that it meant power, yes, but power over the powerful, rather than power over the helpless. Whether that distinction held, whether the fire remained a liberating thing or became, in the end, the same fire her father had ordered from his throne room. This is where the story of Aerys and the story of Daenerys begin to speak to each other across the decades between them. She burned in the final hours of her arc, in ways that she had spent years insisting she would not. And the city she burned was the same city her father had tried and failed to burn. The pots he had placed beneath it were removed by then, the wildfire long since disposed of or rendered harmless by time and moisture. But the fire arrived anyway, just from the other direction. Let that thought drift now, upward, like smoke, like the cinders that rise from a great fire into the night air, catching the updraft and travelling high before they cool. The story of Aerys and fire is not simply a story of cruelty, though cruelty is part of it. It is a story about what happens when a mind that has been damaged in particular ways organizes itself around a particular solution and begins to see that solution everywhere. Fire solved things in Aerys's cosmology. Fire was clean, fire was final. It was the only form of resolution that his increasingly brittle logic could trust. He was not in the end a man who enjoyed suffering for its own sake. He was a man who believed, genuinely, deeply, in the way that only genuine belief can sustain a structure as extreme as the one he was building, that what he was doing was necessary. The subscriber note that closes this part of the story is this: the most dangerous thing about Aerys was not the fire. It was the certainty. If you are still here, still resting, still listening, consider subscribing. The next story will be waiting when you return. There is always another chapter, another history, another long night of quiet telling. Sleep well and come back. But before the fire consumed everything, there was a prince. And the prince was, in almost every way that mattered, his father's opposite, which is precisely why his very existence became, in Aerys's deteriorating mind, the most personal threat of all. Somewhere in the quiet of this night, let the image of fire dim slowly, the way a fire dims when no one tends it, the red deepening to amber, the amber dimming to orange, the orange cooling to the slow pulse of embers that still hold heat but no longer throw light. Stay with that ember glow. There is warmth in it without danger. The story is not done with fire, but it is pausing here before the very worst of it to consider a different light, the particular light that a remarkable young man throws across a darkening time without intending to, simply by being present and being what he is. Rhaegar Targaryen is one of the most discussed figures in the history of the Seven Kingdoms, which is a remarkable thing given that he died young and left no writings and no direct account of his own thinking. What survives of him is entirely constructed from other people's responses to him, from the way lords who met him described those meetings afterward, from the way opponents of his father began to speak of the crown prince as though the succession itself were a solution to the problem of the reign, from the way even those who later fought against his house found it difficult to speak of him without a particular quality of regret that they did not apply to the father. He was born, as noted before, at Summerhall during the fire of 259, a fire that killed members of the royal family, and that remained, in Targaryen memory, one of the starkest examples of the ambition that the last dragon's absence had not entirely extinguished. Aegon Verhaef, his great-grandfather, had died there, some accounts said, in an attempt to hatch dragon eggs, through a combination of fire and sorcery that went catastrophically wrong. Rhaegar arrived in this world at the same moment the world around him was burning, and this was taken as an omen by those who interpreted such things. Though whether it was an omen of his own fire, or of the fire that would eventually destroy his family, was a question the interpreters could not agree on. As a child he was, by multiple accounts, melancholy in a way that concerned those around him. Not the melancholy of unhappiness, not the specific melancholy of a child who is suffering, but the more expansive kind, the kind that seems native to a certain type of mind, a quality of awareness about the heaviness of things that most people spend their childhoods shielded from, and that some people are born already knowing. He came to books young, and he did not leave them. The histories of the Citadel, the accounts of the old Valyrian dragon lords, the fragments of prophecy that had accumulated in various corners of the library, he absorbed all of it with the serious, unhurried attention of someone extracting information that was going to be necessary for something he had not yet been told about directly. Music came later, and it came to him in the way that genuine vocations arrive, not as a skill to be developed, but as a means of saying things he had no other language for. He played the harp, and those who heard him play described the experience in ways that suggested it was distinct from simply hearing skilled musicianship. There was something in his playing that communicated directly to whatever it is in a person that receives beauty without processing it through the usual filters of interpretation and commentary. People wept at his playing without knowing why they were weeping. He was reported to have been moved himself, in the way of someone playing who is also hearing something, receiving as well as giving. It is worth sitting with the image of this man, this silver-haired, harp-playing, book-absorbed young prince, and the image of his father, increasingly unkempt, increasingly frantic, surrounded by the pyromancers and their green fire in the rooms below the Red Keep, and allowing both images to exist simultaneously. They were in the same family. They shared the same blood. They lived in the same castle, attended the same feasts, appeared together on ceremonial occasions with the ceremonial composure that royal families apply to public functions, regardless of the private weather. And underneath all of that, the relationship between them was one of the most painful that either of them navigated. The father who had loved the idea of a son and found himself unable to love the specific son he had been given, and the son who understood this and could not fix it, and eventually perhaps stopped trying. Aerys's fear of Rhaegar as a political threat had a specific date of origin, as best the historical record can establish it. The great tourney at Harrenhal in the year 281, that spectacular and strange event that brought the whole of the realm's nobility together in the ruins of the greatest castle ever built, on a scale of pageantry and competition that had not been seen in a generation, was the event at which everything converged. Rhaegar competed in the joust and won, as he generally did at such competitions. He won the champion's crown, the garland of winter roses, the right to give the prize of beauty to whomever he chose. He rode past his own wife, Elia of Dawn. He rode past the gathered ladies of the court. He placed the crown of winter roses in the lap of Lyanna Stark, 16 years old, already promised to Robert Baratheon. What Rhaegar meant by this, what it signified about his feelings, his intentions, the state of his marriage, the content of his thinking, has been argued about ever since. What matters for the story of Aerys is what it looked like. It looked like the crown prince, who was already spoken of by certain lords as a candidate for replacing his father through some mechanism of forced abdication, making a public declaration of preference for a northern girl, whose family had powerful connections and whose betrothed was one of the most formidable fighting men in the realm. Aerys, watching, saw not a romantic gesture, but a political statement. He saw his son aligning himself with houses that could support a coup. He saw the future arriving early, and he saw it as a threat. The subsequent disappearance of Lyanna Stark, whether it was an abduction or a willing departure, a question the evidence divides on in ways that the main series eventually resolves, but that Aerys had no access to, became, in Aerys's mind, the opening move of exactly the coup he had feared. Rhaegar had taken a Northern Lord's daughter. Brandon Stark had come to King's Landing demanding justice. Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon, both ward-raised in the Eyrie under Jon Arryn, were being called to answer for their foster brother's actions. Every family tie, every political alliance, every connection between the rebel houses looked, from inside Aerys's perspective, like evidence of the organized conspiracy he had been expecting for years. He was not imagining the rebellion. The rebellion was real, but his interpretation of what it was, a plot against him personally rather than a response to his increasingly intolerable rule, meant that every decision he made in response to it was wrong. Rhaegar's obsession with prophecy, with the specific cluster of predictions that the old texts called the Prince that was promised, the one who would face the great darkness and determine the fate of the world, is one of the more poignant aspects of his character, because it represents a man of genuine intelligence applying that intelligence to a problem that could not be solved by intelligence alone. He was convinced after years of study that the prophecy was real and that he was part of its fulfillment. He was also convinced, somewhere in the long years of his reading, that the child who would fulfill it was not himself, but a child he had yet to father, a belief that would eventually reshape the entire course of his life, and the life of a young woman from the north, and the political geography of the Seven Kingdoms. The theory he had developed, the specific interpretation he had arrived at through his reading of the old texts, suggested that the Prince of Prophecy would be born of the line of the dragon, in from the union of ice and fire. Whether he was right about the prophecy is less interesting in some ways than the fact that he organized his most consequential decisions around it, that a man of his obvious intelligence could look at a cluster of ancient texts and decide that they were telling him something specific about his own obligations in a specific year of his specific life. Elia of Dawn was his wife, and the history's treatment of Elia tends to position her as a victim of events rather than a participant in them, which does her a disservice. She was a woman of the southern culture, the Dornish tradition that was different in almost every way from the Northern Reserve, more open in its expression of feeling, more comfortable with complexity in the arrangement of relationships, more accustomed to the idea that love and marriage and duty could occupy different spheres without catastrophe. She had married Rhaegar, knowing he was a man of consuming interior preoccupations, knowing the crown came with its particular burdens, knowing that her role in his life was partly dynastic and partly something more personal, and that the ratio of those two elements was not entirely under her control. She bore him 2 children. She was beloved by those at court who knew her, for the warmth and genuine quality of her presence. And she was in the Red Keep during all of the years this story traces, present in the background, managing the ordinary and extraordinary demands of being a princess, in a court that was increasingly difficult to be a princess in, raising children in a castle where the king was becoming someone that mothers instinctively wanted their children kept away from. Jon Snow carries more of Rhaegar than anyone knew for the first 17 years of his life. He carries Rhaegar's silver heritage hidden under the black stark colouring that his mother's blood gave him. He carries Rhaegar's tendency toward melancholy and toward gravity, that quality of taking the weight of things seriously, of being incapable of treating consequential decisions as anything other than consequential. He carries, perhaps most profoundly, Rhaegar's sense of being born to a specific purpose without quite knowing what that purpose requires of him in practice. Rhaegar spent his young adulthood deep in the study of prophecy, convinced that the world was moving towards something vast, and that he had a role in it that he needed to understand. Jon Snow spent his young adulthood at the Wall, watching the darkness grow beyond it, understanding that he was part of something enormous without having been given adequate explanation of why or how. The tragedy of Rhaegar is that he was, by almost every account, a man who would have been a genuinely good king. He had the temperament, the intelligence, the charisma, and the genuine philosophical seriousness that the Iron Throne had not seen in a Targaryen for a long time. He had the capacity to listen. He had the capacity to understand that ruling was a moral project rather than simply a practical one. But he lived in the shadow of a father who was afraid of him, who could not allow him to prepare adequately for rule, because adequate preparation looked like accumulation of allies. And accumulation of allies looked, to Aerys, like positioning for a coup. And so Rhaegar was never permitted to be the king he might have been, because the preparation for that kingship was structurally indistinguishable from treason, and because the king he would have had to replace in order to become what he might have been was still alive and still watching. Let his story rest here for a moment, in the quiet of this chapter's close. Rhaegar Targaryen, the prince who was promised, the silver harpist, the man who placed winter roses in a northern girl's lap and changed the course of everything, deserves a full telling of his own. And this night's long telling of his father's story has been faithful to that distinction. He was not his father. He was, in some essential way, the refutation of his father, proof that the line had not been entirely consumed by what the line had become. But he was also the product of his father's court, his father's fear, his father's choices, and those things shaped him in ways he could not have entirely escaped even if he had lived longer. Which he did not. The trident was ahead of him, and the trident was waiting. But before the trident, there is still the question of Tywin Lannister, and the way that friendship finally broke. Between the father who burned things and the prince who played the harp, there was a third figure whose presence ran through the entire story, like a root through stone. A man who had loved Aerys once, genuinely, and who would end up demonstrating that love and hatred are not opposites so much as the same investment directed differently. Breathe slowly. Let the rhythm of it settle you further into the quiet that has been gathering through this long telling. We are past the midpoint now, past the place where the story still contained its uncertain futures, the place where things might still have been different. What remains is the accounting, the long reckoning with what was set in motion and could not be stopped. But before we arrive at the rebellion and the sack and the killing, we need to spend time with the relationship at the center of it all. The one that started everything. The one that Aerys himself, at the very end of his life, had still not understood correctly. Tywin Lannister was, by the time Robert's Rebellion began, one of the most powerful men in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. This is not hyperbole. He had served as Hand of the King for nearly 2 decades, during which he had reformed the tax structure of the realm, reorganized the administration of the Crownlands, settled 3 border disputes that had been festering for generations, suppressed the Rain-Tarbeck rebellion with a completeness that became legendary, and transformed the relationship between the Iron Throne and the major houses into something more functional than it had been since the first Aegon. He had also made himself enormously wealthy, which was not irrelevant. The wealth of Casterly Rock, the Lannister gold, was not merely personal fortune, but a strategic resource that the crown had come to rely on in ways that made Tywin's cooperation with the throne a structural necessity rather than simply an option. and Aerys hated him for it. Not without interruption, not without the complication of the old affection that never entirely died, but with a consistency and an intensity that grew with each passing year of the reign. The hatred was, at its root, the hatred of a man who cannot forgive another man for being necessary. Aerys needed Tywin in the way that a person needs the competence they lack and cannot acquire, the way that need feels not like gratitude but like resentment, because it illuminates the absence it compensates for. Every time Tywin solved something, Aerys was reminded that he himself had not solved it. Every efficiency that Tywin introduced was evidence, in Aerys's reading, that the realm's confidence was in the hand rather than the king. And while this was not entirely wrong as an observation, the response to it, to undermine Tywin, rather than to work alongside him, to deny him authority and credit, rather than to find ways of asserting the crown's own preeminence more constructively, made everything worse. There was also Joanna Lannister, Tywin's wife, who had died in childbed in the year 263, giving birth to twins, one of whom would become Cersei, and the other Jaime, and a third child, Tyrion, who arrived misshapen in Tywin's vision of what his children should be. Joanna had been a presence at court before her marriage, during the years when Aerys was young, and Tywin was young, and the court was the place where the most interesting people in the realm converged. There are accounts, carefully worded, diplomatically hedged, but present in the historical record, that Aerys had in those early years. An attachment to Joanna that went beyond the ordinary social warmth of a young king toward an attractive courtier. He had made comments about her, on at least one public occasion, at Joffrey's name day feast, years after her death, that was so specifically inappropriate that they reached the ears of Tywin's children and lodged in the memory of everyone who heard them. What Tywin felt about Aerys's behavior toward his wife is a matter of historical inference rather than direct documentation. Tywin was not a man who expressed his interior life openly at any point, under any circumstances. He was the kind of person who converts strong feeling into action rather than expression, who processes emotional injury through the long, patient architecture of consequence. What he did, in the years following Joanna's death, was continue to serve, continue to be the indispensable engine of the realm's governance, while the wall between himself and his king grew taller and colder year by year, built of accumulated small indignities that neither man directly acknowledged. The final break, when it came, had the quality of something that had been inevitable for years, and was nonetheless startling in the moment of its arrival. Aerys, in one of his most deliberate and calculated acts of aggression against his hand, named Jaime Lannister to the Kingsguard. Jaime was 15 or 16, already showing the extraordinary physical talent that would define him, already the subject of admiring comment from every knight who trained alongside him. He would, under any ordinary circumstances, have been Tywin's heir, the son who would inherit Casterly Rock and the Lannister wealth and the prestige of the family, the son whose children would continue the line. Aerys stripped all of that away. Membership in the Kingsguard required the renunciation of lands and titles and inheritance. Aerys took Tywin's heir and made him a white sword, and in doing so ensured that Casterly Rock would pass eventually to Tyrion, whom Tywin, in his most private and least defensible thinking, regarded as the child whose arrival had cost him Joanna. Tywin resigned the handship and returned to Casterly Rock. He did not do this dramatically. He did not issue declarations or make speeches. He simply left, which was, for a man of his temperament, the most unambiguous statement available. He had served for 2 decades. He had made the reign possible. He had subordinated himself over and over again to a king he was increasingly convinced was dangerous, not merely difficult, not merely erratic, but genuinely and irreversibly dangerous. The kind of dangerous that could not be managed anymore, could only be endured or ended. He went home. He watched from the golden halls of Casterly Rock as the reign that he had sustained for 20 years began its final unravelling without him. Cersei, his daughter, was 12 years old when she arrived at King's Landing to be presented as a potential bride for the Crown Prince. She was sharp enough, even at 12, to read a room. She grew up, in the years she spent in King's Landing, in that strange in-between status of hopeful future queen, observing the court of Aerys II with the particular attentiveness of someone trying to understand what had happened and what might happen, and how to navigate both. What she absorbed in those years was a complete education in the politics of fear. She saw how Aerys operated. She saw how the men around him operated in response. She saw what power looked like when it had lost its confidence and begun to defend itself through terror, rather than through the kind of authority that commands genuine loyalty. She also saw her father leave, and what that departure communicated to a 12-year-old girl who already understood power as the organizing principle of human interaction, a lesson Tywin had taught and continued to teach by his own example, was that the Lannister way of responding to an intolerable situation was to withdraw and wait and position, and then, when the moment arrived, to act decisively and completely. This lesson would organize itself over the decades of Cersei's life into the particular kind of political intelligence she developed, brilliant and deeply limited simultaneously, effective in the short term, and catastrophic in the long term, precisely because it had been learned in the court of a mad king, rather than in any healthier political environment. The whispers about Jaime and Cersei, which became in time far more than whispers, were also rooted here, 2 children, placed in strange circumstances by a father whose relationship with emotion was controlled to the point of suppression, isolated in a castle that ran on fear, trained since birth in the Lannister ethic of family as the primary and perhaps only loyalty, growing up in the shadow of a brilliant and terrifying father who showed love through strategy and expectation, rather than through warmth, whatever the relationship between Jaime and Cersei was. And this history does not need to dwell on it at length. It was shaped, at the root, by Tywin, and by Aerys, and by the particular things that happened when those 2 men's long friendship became, at the end, a long war. The specific mechanisms of Tywin's administrative genius deserve a moment of attention, because they are not simply the background to the Aerys story, but the thing that in its absence made the final years so catastrophically difficult to manage. Tywin had built a system of governance that functioned because it was organized around competent people in the correct positions, their relationships to each other made explicit, their reporting lines clear, their incentives aligned with the realm's actual needs rather than with the preferences of whoever happened to be king that season. He had reformed the tax collection apparatus across 3 regions that had been chronically inefficient. He had regularized the process by which disputes between lesser lords were adjudicated without consuming the small council's attention. He had established a financial relationship with the Iron Bank of Braavos that kept the crown's credit reliable even in difficult years. All of this left when Tywin left, not because it could not be maintained without him, but because the men who replaced him as Hand of the King were chosen for qualities other than administrative competence, were chosen, in successive appointments, for their willingness to agree with Aerys, which was the one quality that was structurally incompatible with giving Aerys the counsel he needed to hear. John Connington, Colton Chelstead, Rossart the pyromancer chief. The list of men who held the handship after Tywin is a list of increasingly inadequate replacements that charts the decline of the position's influence with mathematical clarity. Connington was a capable military commander who was also in love with Rhaegar, which gave him loyalties that divided in ways that complicated his counsel. Chelstead served briefly and was burned when he protested the accumulation of wildfire under the city, executed by the very method he had been protesting, which is the kind of dark irony that Aerys' reign produced with depressing regularity. Rossart, who replaced Chelstead, was the head of the pyromancers, which meant that the man advising the king on the disposition of wildfire was the same man who produced the wildfire, and who therefore had no structural incentive to advise moderation. By the time the Lannister army appeared at the gates, the position of hand had been reduced to something close to ceremonial. The advisor whose job had become ratifying rather than tempering, confirming rather than questioning, because questioning was the thing that got you burned. Tyrion, the third child, carries the weight of the Tywin-Aerys story in a different way. He was born the day Joanna Lannister died, and Tywin never forgave him for it, an injustice so comprehensive and so persistent that it would eventually produce the act that brought the Lannister family to the edge of its own dissolution. Tyrion grew up understanding that he was not wanted in the place he most needed to be wanted, and he responded to this by becoming more intelligent and more observant and more capable than anyone who dismissed him had anticipated, and by arriving, eventually, in service to a Targaryen queen who was also her father's daughter, and also struggling with inheritance. The connections run so deep through this story that they begin to feel less like coincidence and more like the river finding its course. The way water will find the path that gravity has made for it through the stone. Let the weight of the Tywin question settle now, slowly. The most powerful man in Westeros, and the king he had loved and eventually abandoned, the story of how that relationship broke and what it set in motion runs through everything that followed like a vein of gold through dark rock. Tywin went home. The realm went on without him. And within 3 years, the realm was burning. The warmth of this long night is steady around you. The story has one more movement before the final fire. The rebellion that ended the world Aerys had managed to ruin. And the question of what happens when the gates of King's Landing open and the lions finally come in. Tywin Lannister went home. The hand was gone. And into the space that his departure created, the administrative, political, and stabilizing space that 20 years of extraordinary governance had maintained, something poured that could not be contained by any of the men who remained. The rebellion had not yet begun when Tywin left, but it was already, in every meaningful sense, inevitable. Let yourself sink a little deeper into the rest that has been building through this long night of history. The fire is banked lower now in whatever chamber of the imagination you have been moving through. The candles have burned down to shorter stubs. Outside, the city of King's Landing moves through its midnight hours. The dock's quiet, the street lanterns dim, the Red Keep a mass of shadows on its hill with only the high windows lit. We are approaching the end of a world, not the end of the world. The kingdom survived, the people survived, and something new came after. As something new always does. But the world of the Targaryen dynasty, 3 centuries of dragon-descended rule, was approaching its last hours. And they were exactly as violent as the centuries before them. Robert's rebellion, The war that ended Targaryen rule in Westeros is sometimes called the War of the Usurper by those who retained loyalty to the old dynasty, and the liberation by those who fought against Aerys and who had reasons, personal and political, to remember it that way. The truth, as with most truths of this kind, does not fit neatly into either framing. It was not a clean moral campaign with heroic intentions throughout. It was a war that began with grief and rage, and the kind of righteous fury that burns very hot and very pure in its first stage, and that accumulated, as it went on, the complications and moral ambiguities that accumulate around any enterprise involving armies and death, and the politics of the morning after. The proximate cause, the thing that the history books list as the beginning, was Lyanna Stark, the betrothed of Robert Baratheon, daughter of Rickard, sister of Brandon and Eddard. She disappeared in the aftermath of the tourney at Harrenhal, under circumstances that the realm at large understood as abduction by Rhaegar Targaryen. Whether this understanding was correct, and whether she was taken, or whether she went willingly, and what the difference between those two things was in the particular circumstances of her specific life and her specific desires, is a question the main series answered, over decades of storytelling, in ways that complicated the origin narrative without changing its consequences. She was gone. Rhaegar had taken or received her. The execution of her father and brother in King's Landing had followed. And Robert Baratheon, the most physically formidable fighter in the realm, had a personal grief and a personal fury that translated directly and without filter into the most capable military campaign the Seven Kingdoms had seen in generations. Jon Arryn of the Eyrie was the man who made the rebellion possible in its organizational form, when Aerys demanded that Arryn surrender Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, his wards, his almost sons, the young men he had raised in his mountain castle above the clouds. Arryn refused. He refused the command of his king, knowing what refusal meant, and in refusing, he committed himself to the path that refusal required. He called his banners. The houses of the Vale rose in response to their lord's call, and Robert and Ned rode out from the Eyrie under the Arryn moon and falcon, and the war that would end the Targaryen dynasty began, not with a great speech or a formal declaration, but with the simple logistics of men who had decided that what they were doing could not be undone, and therefore needed to be done quickly and well. The strategic unfolding of the rebellion is a long story with many movements, and this is not the night to trace it in its full tactical detail. What matters for the story of Aerys is what was happening inside the Red Keep while the war progressed. He had retreated, by the time the fighting was fully underway, into a kind of inner chamber of himself that admitted very few visitors. The pyromancers came and went. The Wildfire production had accelerated. His conversations with those advisors who still had access to him were, by multiple accounts, increasingly incoherent, not always, not in every exchange, but with enough frequency that those around him began to document a pattern in his better and worse hours. The Varys-shaped presence in his small council, the master of whisperers who served whoever sat on the throne with equal smoothness, kept the king's finger pressed as regularly as possible to the pulse of the war. But what Aerys did with the information he received was becoming harder to predict. Varys is a figure who deserves his own long telling, and this is not quite the place for it. But he moves through this story at its edges in ways that are impossible to ignore. He had come from the free cities, this eunuch who spoke with perfect courtliness and remembered everything, and served, by his own later account, not any particular king, but the concept of the realm. In the final years of Aerys's reign, he was serving a man who was functionally incapable of being served well, whose decisions had moved beyond the reach of council, who was making choices about the disposition of Wildfire beneath a city of 500,000 people that no amount of strategic information could redirect into something safe. Varys knew what the caches were. He knew where they were placed. What he did or did not do with that knowledge in the months before the sack is a question the records do not resolve. It is worth pausing now, just a breath's worth of pausing, a moment of stillness in the long unwinding of this story, to think about the people of King's Landing during these months. The lords and the knights and the highborn figures who move through the official accounts were only a small portion of the city's population. The city itself held hundreds of thousands of people who did not appear in the small council minutes, who were not recorded in the chronicles of battles, who were simply living the ordinary lives of ordinary people in a city that happened to be the seat of a deteriorating king. They baked bread, they sold cloth, they quarrelled with their neighbours about the noise from the forge next door. The war was news to them and frightening news, but wars had come and gone, and cities had survived them. What they did not know, what almost no one outside the immediate circle of Aerys and his pyromancers knew, was that they were living above a city-sized killing device that one unstable man's final word could detonate. The Battle of the Trident, in 283, was the military moment that settled the war's outcome beyond any reasonable possibility of reversal. Rhaegar emerged from whatever private withdrawal he had been occupying and came to meet Robert Baratheon's army at the crossing of the Trident. He died there. Robert Baratheon was the most powerful fighter of his generation, and he met Rhaegar in the middle of a river and killed him with a blow that was described afterward as absolute, the kind of blow that leaves no ambiguity about what has happened. The rubies from Rhaegar's armour were scattered by the force of it across the river bottom, and they were found and kept as relics by those who understood that they were picking up the scattered pieces of a dynasty. Aerys received the news of his son's death inside the Red Keep. By the accounts of those who were with him in that moment, his response was not the response of a father. Or rather, whatever paternal grief was in it was immediately processed into the paranoid framework that had become his primary mode of experiencing events. Rhaegar was dead, which meant the battlefield had been lost. The army was in retreat. The Lannister host was, as Aerys had known, approaching King's Landing, arriving, as he understood it, to save him. He sent ravens. He prepared to receive his old friend's son with the full dignity of the crown. He prepared, that is, to be saved. He did not yet understand, or chose not to understand, that a man like Tywin did not move an army toward a besieged city in order to save what was inside it. He moved it toward a besieged city because the besieged city was a prize, and the timing of its fall was a matter of strategic calculation. Robert Baratheon's hatred of the Targaryens is one of the formative facts of the period that followed. He hated the name, hated the heritage, hated the memory of what Rhaegar had done, or what he believed Rhaegar had done, with a specificity and a persistence that shaped every political decision he made. For the 17 years of his reign, he refused to speak of them with anything approaching neutrality. He refused to extend mercy to the surviving members of the family. He refused, in his most significant failure of political wisdom, to find a version of ending the dynasty that left no exiled heirs across the narrow sea with legitimate claims to reclaim. His hatred was honest, and it was personal, and it was, in the long arc of consequence, one of the most destabilizing things to survive the war. Because Daenerys survived, and Viserys survived, and the hatred that Robert carried into his reign ensured that no accommodation with the surviving Targaryens was ever explored or attempted, so that the question of the throne was never genuinely settled, but only paused. Ned Stark came out of the rebellion with a different relationship to what had happened. He had fought the war, and he had seen it to its conclusion, and he carried home from it a secret that he could not share with anyone, a truth that sat in the centre of his life like a stone in the centre of a river, with everything else flowing around it, shaped by its presence but never directly acknowledging it. Jon Snow, growing up in Winterfell's Great Hall, did not know what that stone was. He felt only its effects, the particular care that Ned extended to him, the specific quality of the protection that never quite explained itself. The rebellion was not over when the battle ended. It was over only when the consequences of the battle had been fully distributed, which took decades, and arguably was not over even when the main story began. The people of the realm who fought in Robert's rebellion, the knights and common soldiers and household guard, who rode out under their lord's banners toward a cause that was partly righteous and partly personal, and partly simply the momentum of an institution that had been running in one direction and finally reversed, carried the war home with them in ways that a continent kept feeling for a generation afterward. The men who had seen the Targaryen banner burned, and the dragon skulls removed from the Red Keep and replaced with stag and lion, carried that iconography into their children's understanding of what power looked like and who held it rightfully. The men who had burned villages and crossed rivers and buried companions in foreign soil carried those particular memories into the marriages and harvests and winter preparations of the years that followed. Wars end on battlefields and continue in people. Robert's rebellion ended officially with the sack of King's Landing and the killing of the last king of the old dynasty. It continued, quietly and without ceremony, in every person who had been in it and in every child who grew up hearing about it, including a girl with silver hair, who grew up across a narrow sea hearing a version of it that cast her family as its victims, and her return as its correction. If you are still here, still resting, still listening, consider subscribing. The next story will be waiting when you return. There is always another chapter, another history, another long night of quiet telling. Sleep well and come back. The story of the rebellion is the story of a war that was necessary and that also destroyed things that were irreplaceable. It ended a dynasty that had produced monsters and geniuses and everything in between. It ended the possibility of Rhaegar's kingship, which was perhaps the most significant thing that did not happen in this entire history. It ended on the field at the Trident with rubies in a river. And then the armies turned toward King's Landing, and the question of what would happen when the gates opened became the central question of everything. Let the weight of that question settle around you now, like a blanket settling over a sleeping form. The last night of the dynasty was only hours away, and in the Red Keep, one young man in a white cloak was still standing at his post, watching his king make the final preparations for a decision that would define the rest of his life. The Lannister army arrived at the gates of King's Landing. Aerys opened them. He believed, genuinely truly in the organized labyrinth of his thinking believed, that Tywin Lannister had come to save him. He had not understood, not even then, that the man he had humiliated and undermined and tried to diminish for 2 decades had arrived not as a rescuer, but as a conqueror. And the city was about to pay for that misunderstanding. Breathe slowly. Let the air move in and out with the unhurried patience of someone who has all night and knows it. we are arriving at the central event of the entire story. The night that ended the Targaryen dynasty. The night that created the world that Jon Snow and Daenerys and Cersei and Tyrion and Jaime and all of the others were born into. It is not a comfortable night to spend time in. But it is the night that everything flows from, the hinge on which everything turns. And to understand what came after, we need to understand what happened inside the Red Keep in the hours between the Lannister army entering the city and Jaime Lannister standing over the body of the man he had sworn to protect. The city fell quickly. That is the first thing to establish, because the speed of it matters. The Lannister army did not lay a long siege. It did not arrive and establish positions and wait. It entered King's Landing with the velocity of an army that knew the gates would open, and that had been organized to take maximum advantage of the moment when they did. Aerys had commanded the city's gates opened upon the arrival of the Lannisters, his old friend's army, come at last to help, and the gates were opened. And what entered through them was not help. The sacking of King's Landing in the final hours of 283 was thorough and terrible, and conducted with the efficiency of a military operation that had been planned rather than improvised. This was Tywin Lannister's work. It had the unmistakable signature of a man who had been thinking about this for a long time. The specific atrocities of the sack are not what this telling needs to dwell on at length. This is not a retelling designed to catalogue suffering. What matters is the atmosphere inside the Red Keep. As the sounds of a city being overrun by an army penetrated the thick stone walls, the distant clash, the screaming that was indistinguishable from ordinary street noise, until it became too consistent, too directional, too obviously moving closer. Aerys was receiving reports. The reports were not reassuring. The Lannister army was not distinguishing between loyalists and enemies. The soldiers in the streets were not behaving like rescuers, and Aerys, hearing this through the increasingly panicked voices of the men who brought him information, made the determination that Tywin had betrayed him, a determination that was correct, and that arrived too late to be actionable, and that, in the specific form it took, was still organized around the paranoid framework of his own persecution, rather than the more straightforward political calculation that Tywin was simply taking what he wanted. The pyromancers received their orders. The caches of wildfire beneath the city, the ones that had been accumulating for years, placed with such care beneath the sept of Baelor, and the gates and the stables and the districts where the population was densest, were to be lit. The command was as old as Aerys's deepest fear. Burn them all. Not a specific them, not a targeted group, not a strategic deployment of fire against the invading army. Everyone, the whole city, 500,000 people to be incinerated, because Tywin Lannister had turned his army through the gates, and the world had finally proven itself to be as treacherous as Aerys had always known it was. He would not be taken prisoner again. He had promised himself that in the dungeon at Duskendale, and he would keep that promise in the most absolute way available to him. Lord Rossart, the head of the Pyromancers Guild, was the man who was given the order directly. He left the king's presence to begin the execution of the command, and in the corridor between the throne room and wherever Rossart was going, he encountered Sir Jaime Lannister, standing at his post in the white cloak of the Kingsguard. Jaime was 19 years old. He had been in the Kingsguard for 3 years. He had spent those 3 years watching everything that is described in this history play out from the position of a man whose oath, bound him to the king's person, and whose oath also bound him to protect the innocent, and who had been given, by the structure of his obligations, no good way to reconcile the two when they came into direct conflict. They had been coming into direct conflict for 3 years. This corridor, this moment, was the final convergence. It is worth pausing here for a long, still moment. Not to let the dramatic tension build. This is not that kind of story, and building tension in a sleep narration serves no one's rest. But because what Jaime Lannister faced in that corridor was a moral problem of the kind that most people never encounter in their entire lives, he had sworn an oath. The oath was the organizing principle of his identity. He had given up everything, his inheritance, his father's name in the sense of carrying it forward, the normal life he might otherwise have had, in exchange for the honor of that oath, and the identity that came with wearing the white cloak. And the king he had sworn that oath to us had just given the order to murder 500,000 people, not in battle, not as the consequence of a war, by burning the city they were living in without their knowledge or consent. He killed Rossart first, in the corridor quickly, before the order could be carried forward to the men who were waiting to execute it. Then he returned to the throne room. Then he killed Aerys. He killed the king he had sworn to protect, the man who had plucked him from his father's household and placed him in the king's guard as a political weapon against Tywin, the man in whose reign he had watched Rickard Stark burn and Brandon Stark die, and the entire architecture of everything he had been raised to believe in corrode and collapse. He killed him from behind, a sword thrust to the back, and then he cut his throat to be certain, and then he sat down on the Iron Throne, that ancient chair of swords, the throne of the Targaryen dynasty, the seat from which every monarch since Aegon the Conqueror had ruled, and he sat there in his white cloak with the king's blood on the sword in his hand, and he waited. Ned Stark found him there. This is the moment that Jaime Lannister would carry for the rest of his life, not the act of the killing, which he never regretted in any simple sense, but the image of Ned Stark's face when Ned came through the throne room door and found the king's guard sitting on the throne over the body of the king. Ned Stark did not know why. He saw the scene and he understood the scene as its worst interpretation. The Kingslayer, the Oathbreaker, the man who had betrayed the person he swore to protect. And because Ned was Ned, because Ned's relationship with honor was the relationship of a man who had organized his entire self around it, who could not think outside its frame even when the frame was too small for the facts, he did not ask. He rendered judgment in his face and in his posture, and in the word he used afterward when others asked him what had happened. Kingslayer, the word attached to Jaime Lannister the way a brand attaches, permanently defining him in the public imagination as the man who had committed the most dishonored act available to a knight. The fact that the act had saved 500,000 lives was not, in the immediate aftermath, discussed. The Wildfire caches were found and disposed of eventually by those who were told about them, and the information was managed with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the public account of what had happened needed to be simple and morally clear, rather than complicated and morally uncomfortable. Jaime had killed the king. The Wildfire was a detail. History moved on. Daenerys, born on Dragonstone in the storm that swept the island on the night the dynasty ended, was born into the world that the sack created. She was the daughter of the man who had given the order, the burn them all that Jaime had stopped, and she grew up on the other side of the narrow sea, being told a story about her father and her family that did not include the Wildfire. The version she received was of a king wrongfully murdered, a throne wrongfully stolen, a dynasty wrongfully ended. This was not entirely false. The murder was real and the usurpation was real. But it was incomplete in ways that shaped her understanding of her inheritance in ways that were never fully corrected. The Iron Throne stood after the killing. The dynasty had built it from the swords of its enemies, melted by dragonfire. The iron hardened into the grotesque and uncomfortable chair that served simultaneously as symbol and warning. It had outlasted the dragons that melted it. It outlasted Aerys. It would outlast Robert too in time. The throne was the constant. The names that sat on it were the variable. And now a new name was coming. The name that Tywin had been positioning for, through the military campaign that had just concluded, and through the 30 years of careful preparation before it. The lions were in the city. The dragon was dead. And in the corridor outside the throne room, another name was already being decided, in the way that names get decided in the aftermath of wars, by whoever is left standing, and by whatever story they choose to tell about why. What happened to the other members of the court on that night? The people who were not in the throne room, not in the corridors where Jaime moved with his sword, not among the pyromancers who received and then did not carry out the final order, is a part of the history that the official accounts treat with the compression of narrative necessity. The small council had largely dispersed. The maesters were in their chambers or their libraries. The servants were where servants were when the city was being sacked, hiding mostly in the lower levels, and the service corridors that run through the castle like a second invisible version of the public spaces above. Pycelle, the Grand Maester, had opened the gates to the Lannister army on his own initiative, a decision that said something comprehensive about his reading of the political situation and his calculation of where survival lay. He had been serving whoever sat on the throne for a very long time, and he understood, with the particular sophistication of someone who had made an art of institutional survival, that the throne's occupant was about to change, and that the new occupants would be more likely to value a maester who had helped them get in than one who had tried to keep them out. Let the Red Keep settle into silence now, in your imagining of it. The fires are no longer building. The pyromancers are dispersed, their terrible commission unfulfilled, the green-burning compound cooling in its ceramic pots beneath a city that does not know how close it came to not existing. The night is quieter than it was. The swords on the throne are cold in the way that iron is always cold, regardless of what has been done with it or what it represents. Somewhere below, a 19-year-old boy in a white cloak is sitting very still, waiting for whatever comes through the door next, knowing that the word that comes through it will follow him for the rest of his life. He saved the city. He would not be thanked for it. The history of what he did would be rewritten as a betrayal, and it would take decades, the full arc of a long story told across many years, for anything like the truth to surface. He saved 500,000 lives. He was called Oathbreaker for the rest of his life. These two things are both true, and they cannot be reconciled, and they are the knot at the center of everything that Jaime Lannister became. No one who has not been inside that particular impossibility has the standing to judge it simply. And yet, everyone did. Let the night hold you gently now. You have travelled far through this history, through decades and deaths and the slow unwinding of a reign that began with promise and ended with a sword in a corridor. You are tired, perhaps, in the way that long attention makes you tired. Not the frantic tiredness of the day's busy hours, but the slower, deeper tiredness that comes from having actually looked at something large and difficult, and held it in your attention without flinching away. That tiredness is a quiet thing. Let it be quiet. The next part of this story is about the morning after the worst night, and the question of who a person becomes when they have done the irreversible thing and have to keep living in the world that comes after it. Jaime Lannister carried the secret of the wildfire for the rest of his life as his primary secret, more intimate than his relationship with Cersei, more defining than his golden reputation as a swordsman, more central to his interior life than anything he had been publicly celebrated or publicly condemned for. He had killed the king. He knew why. And he discovered, in the days and weeks and months and years after the killing, that knowing why was not the same as being able to say why in a world that had already decided what the answer was. The world had decided that a Kingsguard who killed his king was an oathbreaker. The world had decided that the specific king who had been killed was not the problem, that the problem was the breaking of the oath. The world was wrong in the most specific and important ways, and the world had no interest in being corrected. Ned Stark's response, that single look in the throne room, that cold judgment in the face of a man who had not yet heard the story, but was already certain he knew the shape of it, was the response of the entire realm compressed into one man's features. Ned Stark was not a cruel person. He was not by nature unjust. He was a man of extraordinary personal integrity who had organized that integrity around a code that had no provision for the specific situation he was looking at. His code said oaths were sacred. His code said the Kingsguard's oath was the most sacred of all of the sacred oaths. His code did not have a clause that said, unless the king's command was the extermination of the civilian population of a major city, in which case the question becomes more complicated. There is something almost unbearable about the injustice of Jaime Lannister's reputation when you examine it fully, and it is worth sitting with that for a genuine moment, rather than rushing past it toward what comes next. A 19-year-old boy had stood in the Kingsguard for 3 years, and watched atrocity after atrocity, and been bound by the terms of the oath that organized his life to do nothing. He had watched Rickard Stark die in his armor. He had watched Brandon Stark die struggling. He had stood at his post and observed and been silent because his oath left him no other option, no mechanism for protest, no authorized channel for objection, no legitimate means of stopping a king who had descended past the point where anything except stopping him would serve. He had done all of this. And then, when the stopping was finally necessary and finally within his physical power, he had done it. He had killed the one person in the room who could order 500,000 deaths with 2 words. And he had saved those 500,000 people from dying. And he had gone to sit on the throne and wait for someone to come through the door who would understand what had happened. No one came through the door who understood. Not then, not for a very long time. The story that established itself in the immediate aftermath of the sack, Jaime Lannister the Kingslayer, the Oathbreaker, the man who killed the king he swore to protect, was the story of a specific betrayal that fit a comprehensible moral frame. And comprehensible moral frames are what people reach for in the chaos of aftermath, because they provide the simplicity that chaos denies. The truth that the killing had been not a betrayal, but the only responsible thing available to do, was more complicated, and required knowing about the wildfire, and knowing about the wildfire required either having been in the throne room or trusting Jaime's account of it. Jaime learned quickly that his account was not trusted. He stopped offering it. The silence that Jaime maintained around the reason for the killing was not the silence of guilt. It was something much more complicated. The silence of a man who had tested the available audience and found that the truth, in this particular audience, at this particular moment, was not credible. Or rather, that the truth might be credible, but that the consequences of its being believed would require a restructuring of the entire public narrative about the end of the dynasty, and that those whose authority derived from that narrative had no interest in restructuring it. Robert Baratheon was the new king. His claim to the throne rested partly on the military victory and partly on the moral argument that Aerys had been a tyrant who deserved to be deposed. If Aerys's final act had been an order to burn the city, an order that had been stopped by the very Kingsguard he had appointed as a political weapon against Tywin, the story became more complex. The hero of the story became not Robert, but Jaime, and Robert did not want that story. Tywin Lannister, when the situation was explained to him in whatever private exchange he and his son had in the immediate aftermath, would have understood everything Jaime told him immediately, because Tywin always understood the thing that was not being said in a public account. But Tywin was not a man who went to work correcting public narratives that were working in his family's interest. The Lannisters were in the Red Keep. His granddaughter, though she was not yet born, would sit on a throne. The dynasty had changed from dragon to lion, or at least the lion had been placed in proximity to power in a way that it had not been before. Tywin was not going to spend his political capital on restoring Jaime's reputation, when Jaime's tarnished reputation left the family in a better structural position than a celebrated one would have. Jaime wore the white cloak for years after the killing, continued in the Kingsguard under the new king, continued to answer to the title Kingslayer, in the way you answer to the word that defines you publicly, regardless of its accuracy, with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been called something wrong long enough that correcting it has become more effort than it is worth. He trained with the sword in the mornings and attended his duties, and appeared in public with the expression of a man who had made a decision about what face to show the world, and was sticking to it regardless of what the world chose to think. He was brilliant at his duties. He was, by every technical measure, among the best swords in the realm. None of this mattered to the people who had named him. The Jaime Lannister who appears in the early chapters of the main story, the Golden Knight, the arrogant smiler, the man who pushes a child from a window to protect a secret, and who wears his reputation for dishonor, with the specific defiance of someone who has decided that if the world is going to call him a monster, he might as well perform the part without apology. That Jaime is the product of 15 years of carrying the Kingslayer label in a world that never asked why. The cruelty of his early presentation, the armor of carelessness he wears over everything that matters to him, is the shape that a person takes when they have given up explaining themselves, and decided instead to become the caricature others have already drawn. It is a survival mechanism. It is a tragedy. It is what happens when a person of genuine moral complexity encounters a world that has only flat surfaces available for them to be reflected in. Brienne of Tarth is the person who asked why. She is the person who sat in the mud with Jaime Lannister in a bathhouse at Harrenhal, stripped of his golden hand and his golden reputation, reduced to the basic facts of what he was and what he had done, and listened. And in the listening, in the simple, unguarded act of a person who had organized her life around a code not entirely unlike the one Jaime had once organized his life around, and who was capable of applying that code in a situation where its application was uncomfortable. In that listening, the Kingslayer story began to come apart, and something else began to be visible underneath it. Not a hero, not a villain. A person who had done a necessary thing in impossible circumstances and paid for it with his reputation, and then spent 15 years deciding that the payment was complete, and that he would spend the rest of his life in the debt's interest. The wildfire is still there, underneath King's Landing, in the imagination of anyone who knows the full story. Or rather, the wildfire that Aerys placed there is gone, disposed of in the years after the sack, but the knowledge of what it was and what it nearly did remains in the bones of the city, in the bones of everyone whose lives were saved by a 19-year-old in a white cloak who made the choice that everyone afterward decided was the wrong one. The city stands. The people who would have died in the Green Fire had children who had children, who are part of the population that Daenerys will inherit when she finally crosses the narrow sea. They do not know this. They cannot know it. There is no way in the ordinary flow of life to be grateful for the disaster that did not happen, for the fire that was stopped in a corridor, for the king who gave an order that was not carried out. Let Jaime Lannister's story rest here for a moment, in the particular quality of rest that comes from understanding without resolution. He did the right thing. He paid for it for decades. He eventually found, in the arc of his later life, a version of himself that was closer to the person he had been before the white cloak was placed on his shoulders. Or perhaps a better version, refined by the specific suffering that comes from having been definitively wrong and then slowly, painfully right. He was, in the end, a man who saved a city, and then spent 20 years learning that having saved a city is not the same as being safe from the world's judgment of how you did it. The city endures. The judgment endures with it. And now the last piece of the story is waiting. The daughter who never knew her father, and the fire that passed from one generation to the next through the blood, looking for its outlet. The city survived. The throne passed to a new name. The exile heirs crossed the narrow sea and grew up in places where no one knew their faces. And in the blood of those heirs, something waited. Not the madness exactly, not a predetermined destiny, but the question. The Targaryen question. The fire in the blood, and who would choose what to do with it. You are very close to sleep now, or the nearest thing to it. That warm borderland where the mind is still present, but the body has already gone. Where thoughts are soft and without edges. Where the history you have been traveling through begins to feel like something you are dreaming rather than something you are following. Stay in that borderland. You are exactly where you need to be. The last chapter of the Mad King's story is not about him. It is about what he left behind. Not the ash and the ruin, not the empty throne and the scattered rubies, but the children and the blood, and the question that neither of them had the luxury of choosing whether to answer. There is a theory about the Targaryen bloodline that the maesters of the Citadel discussed carefully, in texts not intended for wide circulation, written in the particular hedged language of scholars who have a professionally uncomfortable conclusion, and are trying to arrive at it without committing too directly. The theory concerned the practice of dynastic marriage within the family, the long-maintained tradition of sibling unions, cousin matches, uncle-niece pairings, the deliberate concentration of the bloodline that the Targaryens had practiced since before the conquest, inherited from the Valyrian culture that produced them. The old Valyrian dragon lords had believed that the dragonfire in their blood required careful management, that it was a resource as well as a gift, something that could be diluted by mixing with lesser lineages, and therefore something that should be preserved through controlled inheritance. What the practice may also have done, over 3 centuries of careful concentration, was intensify certain tendencies of the Targaryen mind in ways that were less predictable than the dragonfire. The capacity for absolute conviction, the difficulty distinguishing between personal will and cosmic destiny, the specific quality of Targaryen certainty, the sense that what the family's blood inclined toward was not merely personal preference, but something that existed on a larger scale, something the world was obliged to accommodate rather than the other way around. In the best Targaryens, this certainty expressed as genuine greatness, as the kind of leadership that changes the world because it believes completely that it can and therefore acts accordingly. In others it became something else, something that closed off rather than opened, that turned inward rather than outward, that began to feed on itself when the world declined to confirm it. Daenerys Targaryen was born in the last hours of the dynasty that this practice had produced. She was born in a storm, on an island, with her mother dying, and her father's reign already a ruin of fire and blood across the narrow sea. She was carried into exile almost immediately, raised by a brother who was visibly and comprehensively damaged by the dispossession that defined his entire early life. And she grew up understanding herself primarily through the frame of what had been taken from her. The throne, the history, the right to be in the place she was supposed to be. This framing was not entirely wrong. But it was also not the whole truth. And the parts it omitted were the parts that would eventually matter most. The warmth of Daenerys's early journey is real, and should not be dismissed in the accounting. The liberation of the enslaved in the great cities of Essos, Astapor, Yunkai, Meereen, was not performed cynically, not organized primarily for political advantage, but expressed a genuine moral conviction that people should not be owned. She freed thousands. She tried to govern well. She struggled with the gap between the idea of liberation and the institutional reality of what comes after, the difficult, unglamorous, exhausting work of building something stable in a place where stability has been deliberately prevented from taking root. She made mistakes, some of them serious, and she tried to learn from them, and the trying was visible and real rather than performed. She also burned people, not many in the early years, proportionate or approximately proportionate to the scale of the provocation. But the burnings had a quality that those around her noticed even when they did not name it, a quality of satisfaction that was not quite vindictive, but that was also not merely instrumental. The fires served a purpose, yes, but they also, in some way that is difficult to articulate precisely, served her. They resolved something in her that nothing else resolved quite as cleanly. They were perhaps the same thing her father had found in them, the feeling of absolute finality, of a problem not merely addressed but eliminated, of the world simplified by heat into the ash that lies clean on the other side of combustion. It is worth pausing here and sitting with the question this raises, rather than hurrying past it in either direction. The question is not whether Daenerys Targaryen was Aerys II. She was not, and the evidence is too abundant to dismiss. She was, in the most important ways, a distinct person with a distinct character who had distinct values and who fought genuine battles against her own worst impulses over many years. The question is whether the inheritance was there regardless. Whether the specific pattern of the Targaryen blood, The greatness and the fire and the absolute certainty that one's own vision of justice is justice itself was something she had been given along with the silver hair and the purple eyes, and whether it was always going to find its expression eventually, in the right circumstances, under sufficient pressure. The burning of King's Landing, when it came in the final season of the story she had been living, came from someone who was exhausted, who had lost people she loved, one after another, with an acceleration that left no time between the losses to grieve any of them adequately, who had arrived in the city that was supposed to be the culmination of everything, the end of the long road across the narrow sea and through the years of exile, only to find that the city's population had not come out to greet her, had not recognized in her arrival the liberation she had imagined, who heard the bells of surrender ringing and felt, in that moment, felt rather than decided, which is the crucial distinction, that ringing was not enough, that the surrender of a city was not the same as its understanding, that the people beneath those bells needed to understand, through their own suffering, what it meant for her to have arrived. Aerys, too, in the dungeon at Duskendale, had made a similar calculation about a similar set of people. They had betrayed him. They had imprisoned him. They needed to understand, through fire, the cost of what they had done. The scale was different. He threatened to burn an entire city to confirm one man's treachery. She burned it to confirm her own arrival. But the internal structure of the reasoning was, in its essential architecture, the same. The complete certainty that the severity of the response was justified by the depth of the grievance. The inability, in the moment of decision, to hear the part of herself that might have said, "This is too much," the fire resolving something that nothing else had been able to resolve. Jon Snow is the synthesis the story offers, or tried to offer, in its anguished final movements. He carries Rhaegar's gentleness and Lyanna's iron will and the northern values of a father who was not his father in blood, but who gave him the formation that blood could not provide. He carries, perhaps, the thing that the Targaryen line had always been trying to produce through its careful concentration of inheritance. The fire, yes, but also the restraint. The capacity to burn and to choose not to. The understanding that the ability to destroy something is not the same as the authority to destroy it, and that the gap between those two things is where all morality lives. He was, in the story's cosmology, the right kind of Targaryen, the one who could hold the fire without being consumed by it. Whether that was justice or simply another kind of loss is the kind of question that this history cannot answer cleanly, because history, real history, the kind made of actual choices by actual people, does not offer the clean resolutions that the shape of a story suggests. Aerys II. Targaryen began as a promising young king and ended as a tyrant who gave the order to burn his own city. Rhaegar was the prince who might have been a good king, and who died in a river before he had the chance. Jaime killed the man he was sworn to protect, and saved the city that his sword's inaction would have destroyed. Daenerys crossed an ocean with her father's fire, and arrived at a city her father had also wanted to burn. Jon carried all of their blood, and none of their absolute certainty, and did the terrible thing that the terrible situation required, and then disappeared from the world that the terrible thing had been done in service of. It is worth sitting with this, with all of it, the full weight of it, the 3 centuries and the blood and the fire and the ash, not to resolve it, but to simply hold it for a moment before you let it go. The question of what Aerys II Targaryen was and what he became and what his becoming made possible and necessary is not a question with a clean answer. It is a question that opens into other questions, the way all genuine questions do. But the asking of it is not wasted. To understand the Mad King is to understand something about what happens when the worst version of a human being is given access to the worst kind of power. And what that costs the people who have to live inside that proximity. And what it plants in the generations that come after, who have to grow up in the world that proximity created. Let it rest now. Let the whole of it, the Red Keep and the Wildfire, and the White Cloak and the Iron Throne, and the Stormborn Daughter, and the River-Killed Prince, let all of it settle into the comfortable weight of a history that belongs to the past now, that is as finished as history ever is, which is to say not entirely finished, but finished enough to examine from this distance without being burned by it. You have travelled far tonight, through the full length of a reign and a dynasty, and the consequences that outlasted both. The watch is long, the night is long, and you are by now deeply enough into the rest that this history was meant to carry you toward, that the next thoughts you have will be the soft, unresisted thoughts of the deepest sleep. The stories will be here tomorrow. The history will keep. The Red Keep will stand in its pages as it has always stood, cold stone and old fire, and the particular weight of everything that happened within its walls, and was felt far beyond them. Let your breathing be its own slow rhythm now, your own tide finding its own shore, needing no instruction. The long night of Aerys II. Targaryen is complete. And now, for you, the shorter and more merciful night, the one with no history in it, only rest, begins. If you are still here, still resting, still listening, consider subscribing. The next story will be waiting when you return. There is always another chapter, another history, another long night of quiet telling. Sleep well and come back. If you made it all the way here, across the full length of this history, leave a comment below with where in the world you are watching from and what the hour is where you are. I am always genuinely curious about that. And if there is a story you would like to see explored in this way, a figure, a dynasty, a forgotten chapter of a world you love, the comments are where that conversation lives. Sleep well, the watch is ended.